You're probably reading this on a screen right now. And that screen, whatever it is connected to something so massive, so unbelievably complex, that no single person fully understands how it works. The internet. But here's what most people don't know. The internet almost didn't happen. And the reason it exists today, the reason you can watch this video, send a message, or look up literally anything you want, comes down to one choice. One decision made by one person that changed everything. And that person? They weren't some tech genius. They weren't even trying to change the world. They were just trying to solve a problem that seemed impossible. This is the story of the choice that created the internet. And trust me, it's not what you think. Let me take you back to a time before any of this existed. Before Wi-Fi, before smartphones, before Google, before email. I'm talking about the 1960s. The world looked different then. America was locked in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Both superpowers were building weapons, racing to space, and trying to outdo each other in every possible way. And in 1957, something happened that terrified the United States government. The Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into space. This tiny beeping ball orbiting Earth sent shockwaves through America. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, what else could they do? Could they launch missiles? Could they attack from space? The fear was real. So President Eisenhower did something about it. In 1958, he created a new agency called ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. The goal was simple. Make sure America stayed ahead in technology. Make sure the Soviets never surprised them again. ARPA had a lot of freedom. They could fund crazy projects. They could take risks. They could think about the future in ways that regular military departments couldn't. And one of the things they started thinking about was communication. Here's the problem they faced. Back then, if you wanted computers to talk to each other, they had to be in the same room. Literally. Computers were massive machines that filled entire rooms. They cost millions of dollars. And they could only do one thing at a time. If you wanted to use a computer, you had to go to where it was, punch in your instructions on cards or tape, and wait for it to process your request. And if that computer broke down or got destroyed, everything was gone. All the data. All the processing power. Gone. Now imagine you're the military during the Cold War. You have important data on computers across the country. Research labs in California. Command centers in Washington. Testing facilities in other states. And you're terrified that the Soviets might launch a nuclear attack. If they hit one location, you lose everything at that location. There's no backup. No way to access that information from somewhere else. This was a huge problem. The military's communication systems at the time were all centralized, meaning they relied on one main hub. Think of it like a wheel. You have the center and then spokes going out to different points. If someone destroys the center, the whole thing falls apart. The military knew this was dangerous. They needed a network that could survive an attack. A network where information could travel through multiple paths. A network where, even if you destroyed part of it, the rest would keep working. But nobody knew how to build that. Computers couldn't talk to each other across long distances. They didn't speak the same language. They weren't designed to work together. It seemed impossible. That's where our story really begins. In 1962, a psychologist named J.C.R. Licklider joined ARPA. Now, you might be wondering why a psychologist was working on computer networks. Good question. Licklider was interested in how humans and computers could work together. He had this vision of a future where people could access computers from anywhere, where computers could share information, where you didn't have to be in the same room as a massive machine to use it. He called it the Galactic Network. Sounds like science fiction, right? Back then, it basically was. Licklider started funding research into this idea. He got scientists and engineers thinking about how to connect computers. He created a community of people who believed this could work, but Licklider himself didn't build the network. He just planted the seed. He left ARPA in 1964, but his vision stayed behind. The people who took over after him kept pushing the idea forward. By the mid-1960s, ARPA was seriously trying to figure out how to connect their computers. They had computers at different universities and research labs across the country, all doing important work. But these computers couldn't share data. If a researcher in California needed to use a computer in Massachusetts, they had to physically travel there. This was expensive, slow, and inefficient. So RPO decided to fund a project to connect these computers. They called it the ARPANET, and this is where things get interesting. Because building a network like this required solving problems that nobody had solved before. And the biggest problem was this: how do you send information across a network in a way that's reliable, fast, and can survive if part of the network goes down? There were a few different ideas floating around. Some people thought you should create dedicated lines between computers, like a telephone call where you have a direct connection for the entire conversation. But this had problems. It was expensive. It tied up resources, and if that line got cut, you were done. Then there was this other idea. A radical idea that seemed crazy to a lot of people. What if, instead of sending information as one continuous stream, you broke it up into little pieces? Like cutting a letter into puzzle pieces, sending each piece through different routes, and then putting them back together at the destination. This way, if one route was blocked, the pieces could take other paths. The information would still get through. This idea was called packet switching, and it was brilliant, but it was also unproven. Nobody had built a network like this before. Nobody knew if it would actually work. Here's where the choice comes in. The choice that created the internet. ARPA needed someone to actually build this network. They needed someone to take the theory of packet switching and turn it into reality, so they put out a call for proposals. They asked companies and organizations to submit their plans for how they would build the ARPANET. And this is where a company called Bolt, Beranek, and Newman comes into the picture. BBN for short. They were a consulting firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They worked on acoustics, computers, all sorts of technical problems. They weren't the biggest company. They weren't the most obvious choice. But they had a team of incredibly smart engineers who believed in packet switching. The head of the team was a guy named Frank Hart, and Frank Hart had to make a choice. BBN could submit a proposal to build the ARPANET, but it would be a massive undertaking. They would have to invent new technology. They would have to solve problems that had never been solved. They would have to build special computers called interface message processors, or IMPs, that could handle packet switching. These IMPs would sit between the main computers and the network, breaking information into packets, sending them out, and putting them back together. Nobody had built an IMP before. Nobody knew if it was possible, and ARPA had a crazy timeline. They wanted this done in less than a year. Most people thought it couldn't be done, that it was too ambitious, too risky. But Frank Hart looked at the problem and thought, we can do this. So BBN submitted their proposal. And they won the contract. This was the choice. Frank Hart and his team at BBN chose to take on a project that most people thought was impossible. They chose to believe in packet switching. They chose to try to build something that had never existed before. And that choice changed everything. Now, winning the contract was just the beginning. Actually building the ARPANET was a whole different challenge. Frank Hart assembled a team of engineers. These weren't just any engineers. These were people who loved hard problems. People who got excited about the impossible. The core team included guys like Bob Kahn, who would later help create the protocols that run the internet. Severo Ornstein, who designed the hardware. Will Crowther, who would later create one of the first computer games. Dave Walden, Ben Barker. These were brilliant people, and they had less than a year to build something that had never been built. Think about what they had to do. They had to design a new kind of computer from scratch. The IMEP had to be small enough to ship to different locations, but powerful enough to handle all the packet switching. It had to be reliable because if it broke down, the whole network would fail. It had to be fast because nobody would use a network that was slow. And it had to be able to connect different types of computers that all worked differently. They worked crazy hours. They solved problems every single day. They had to figure out how to make packets work, how to address them so they knew where to go, how to check them for errors, how to resend them if they got lost, how to make sure they arrived in the right order. Every single piece of this was new. And here's the thing. They were doing all of this with 1960s technology. No modern programming languages, no advanced tools. Just raw engineering and brilliant problem solving. They used a computer called the Honeywell DDP-516 as the base for the IMP. It was a mini computer, which back then meant it was the size of a refrigerator instead of the size of a room. They had to modify it heavily. They had to write all the software from scratch. They had to test everything over and over. Meanwhile, ARPA was choosing which sites would be the first nodes on the network. The first 4 locations were UCLA in Los Angeles, Stanford Research Institute in the Bay Area, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. These sites all had important computer science research going on. They would be the first 4 points on the ARPANET, September 1969. Less than a year after BBN started working on the project, the first IMP was ready. It was shipped to UCLA and installed in the computer lab there. This was the first node on the network. But it wasn't a network yet. It was just one machine, sitting there waiting for another IMP to connect to. The second IMP went to Stanford Research Institute about a month later. And this is where history was made. On October 29, 1969, a programmer at UCLA named Charlie Klein sat down at a computer terminal. He was going to send the first message over the ARPANET to Stanford. The message was supposed to be the word login. Simple, right? Charlie typed the L, it went through. Success. He typed the O, it went through. 2 letters sent across a network using packet switching for the first time in history. Then he typed the G and the system crashed. That's right. The first message ever sent over the network that would become the internet was lo, as in lo and behold. Which is kind of poetic if you think about it. But also frustrating if you're Charlie Klein trying to log in. They fixed the problem and got it working again about an hour later. And after that, the ARPANET was real. 2 computers, hundreds of miles apart, sending information back and forth using packet switching. By the end of 1969, all 4 nodes were connected. UCLA, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, and Utah. The ARPANET was live. And it worked. Information was flowing between these locations. Researchers could access computers at other sites. The impossible had become possible. But here's the thing. The ARPANET was still just a small military research project. 4 nodes. A handful of people using it. Most people in the world had no idea it existed. And even the people building it didn't fully understand what they had created. They thought they were building a tool for researchers to share computer resources. They had no idea they were building the foundation of something that would change human civilization. Over the next few years, the ARPANET grew. More universities joined. More research labs. By 1971, there were 15 nodes. By 1972, there were 29. And as it grew, people started using it in ways that nobody expected. In 1971, a programmer named Ray Tomlinson invented email. He figured out how to send messages between users on different computers. He chose the @ symbol to separate the username from the computer name, which is why email addresses look the way they do today. Email wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't something ARPA asked for. Ray Tomlinson just thought it would be useful. And it turned out to be one of the most important applications ever created. This is a pattern you see throughout the history of the internet. People building tools they think will be useful, and then other people using those tools in completely unexpected ways. The internet wasn't designed, it evolved, it grew. It changed based on what people did with it. But there was still a problem. The ARPANET was just one network. And as computers became more common, other networks started appearing. Universities had their own networks. Companies had their own networks. Different countries had their own networks. And these networks couldn't talk to each other. They used different technologies, different protocols, different rules. It was like having a bunch of islands with no bridges between them. This is where the next crucial choice happened. The choice to make these networks work together. The choice to create the internet as we know it today. And the people who made this choice were Bob Kahn, who had worked on the ARPANET at BBN, and Vint Cerf, a researcher who had been at UCLA during the early days of the network. In the early 1970s, Bob Kahn was thinking about how to connect different networks. He called it internetworking. The idea was to create a set of rules, a protocol that any network could use to communicate with any other network. It didn't matter what technology they used. It didn't matter how they were built. If they all followed the same protocol, they could all connect. Bob Kahn partnered with Vint Cerf, and together they started designing this protocol. They called it the Transmission Control Protocol, or TCP. Later, they split it into 2 parts, TCP and IP, the Internet Protocol. Together, TCP/IP would become the language of the Internet. This was a choice. Kahn and Cerf chose to make this protocol open. They chose to make it available to everyone. They didn't patent it. They didn't try to control it. They wanted anyone to be able to use it. This was huge. Because if they had made it proprietary, if they had tried to own it, the Internet would have developed completely differently. It might have been controlled by one company. It might have been closed off. It might never have grown into what it is today. Instead, they made TCP/IP open and free. And this decision meant that anyone, anywhere, could build a network and connect it to the growing internet. Universities did it. Companies did it. Governments did it. The network of networks kept expanding. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, the ARPANET kept growing, and more networks kept joining using TCP/IP, but it was still mostly universities and research institutions. Regular people didn't have access. The internet was this obscure technical thing that most people had never heard of. That started to change in the 1980s. Personal computers became available. Companies like Apple and IBM were selling computers that regular people could buy and use at home. And some of those people wanted to connect to the internet. Services like CompuServe and Prodigy started offering online access. Bulletin board systems, or BBS, let people dial in with modems and exchange messages. The technology was slow and clunky, but it was the beginning of regular people getting online. In 1989, another crucial moment happened. A researcher at CERN in Switzerland named Tim Berners-Lee was frustrated with how hard it was to share information. Scientists at CERN had data on different computers using different systems, and it was a mess trying to find anything. So Tim Berners-Lee invented something new. He called it the World Wide Web. The web was a system of linked documents. You could create a page with information, and that page could have links to other pages. You could click a link and jump to another document, even if it was on a different computer somewhere else in the world. To make this work, Tim Berners-Lee invented HTML, the language for creating web pages. He invented HTTP, the protocol for transferring web pages. And he invented URLs, the addresses you type into a browser. He created the first web browser and the first web server. And then, just like with TCP/IP, he made it all free and open. This was another choice. Tim Berners-Lee could have patented the web. He could have started a company. He could have become incredibly rich, but he chose to give it away. He chose to make it open so that anyone could use it, build on it, and expand it. And because of that choice, the web exploded. In the early 1990s, the web was still pretty basic. Mostly text pages with simple links. But it was useful. It was accessible, and it was growing fast. Then in 1993, a team at the University of Illinois created a web browser called Mosaic. Mosaic was the first browser that was easy to use. It had a graphical interface. It could display images right on the page. It made the web feel less like a technical tool and more like something anyone could use. Mosaic spread like wildfire. Millions of people downloaded it. And suddenly, the internet wasn't just for researchers anymore. Regular people were getting online. They were creating web pages. They were sharing information. They were starting businesses. The commercial internet was born. Companies realized they could reach customers online. Amazon started in 1994 as an online bookstore. eBay started in 1995 as a place for people to auction items. Yahoo started as a directory of websites. Google came along in 1998 with a better way to search. And everything just kept accelerating. The internet went from a military research project connecting 4 computers to a global network connecting billions of devices. And it all came back to those early choices. The choice to use packet switching. The choice Frank Hart and BBN made to build the ARPANET. The choice to make TCP/IP open and free. The choice to make the World Wide Web open and free. Every single one of these choices mattered. Now, I'm not saying everything about the internet is perfect. Far from it. The internet has created huge problems. Misinformation spreads faster than ever. Privacy is constantly under threat. Big companies have massive control over what we see and do online. Cybercrime is a huge issue. Social media can be toxic. There are legitimate concerns about how the internet affects society. But the fundamental architecture of the internet, the way it's built, is still based on those early principles. It's still open. It's still decentralized. Anyone can create a website. Anyone can send an email. Anyone can build an application. You don't need permission from some central authority. This is incredibly powerful. And it's all because of the choices people made 60 years ago. Let me tell you why packet switching was so important, because this is the key to everything. Before packet switching, communication networks worked like phone calls. When you made a phone call, you got a dedicated line between you and the other person. That line was yours for the entire call. Nobody else could use it. The network is resilient. It's robust. It keeps working even when parts of it fail. This was the insight that made the internet possible. And it came from several people thinking about the problem at the same time. Paul Boran at Rand Corporation was thinking about how to build a network that could survive a nuclear attack. He came up with a packet switching concept in the early 1960s. Donald Davies in England was thinking about how to make computer networks more efficient. He independently came up with packet switching and actually coined the term packet. And Leonard Kleinrock at MIT and later UCLA was working on the mathematics of how packet switching would work. These people didn't all know each other at first. They were working on the same problem in different places. But their ideas came together in the ARPANET, and Frank Hart and the team at BBN took these theoretical ideas and made them real. Building the first EAMP is an enormous challenge. Remember, this is 1969. The moon landing happened in 1969. This was cutting-edge technology. The IMP had to be reliable because it was the foundation of the network. If it crashed, everything stopped. The BBN team had to think through every possible failure mode. What happens if a packet gets corrupted? What happens if a connection drops? What happens if a computer sends bad data? They built in retransmission, so if a packet got lost, it would be sent again. They built in flow control so a fast computer wouldn't overwhelm a slow one. All of these things are fundamental to how the internet works today, and they were invented by the BBN team in 1969. The IMPs themselves were interesting machines. Each one weighed about 900 pounds. They had 12 kilobytes of memory. Let me repeat that. 12 kilobytes. Your phone probably has more than 1,000,000 times more memory than an IMP. But that was enough to make packet switching work. The IMPs were incredibly reliable. Many of them ran for years without failing. As the ARPANET grew, more interesting things started happening. In 1972, ARPA organized a public demonstration of the ARPANET at a conference in Washington, D.C. People realized this was the future. Around the same time, Kahn was working on a new problem. He wanted to connect a mobile network, using radio, to the ARPANET. But the radio network worked completely differently than the ARPANET. Different packet sizes, different reliability, different speeds. How do you connect two networks that are fundamentally different? This is when Kahn realized they needed a new protocol. A protocol that could work on top of any network. A protocol that didn't care if you were using phone lines or radio waves or satellite links. As long as you could move data somehow, this protocol would make it work. That's what led to TCP/IP. Vint Cerf joined Kahn on this project, and they spent years designing and refining TCP/IP. They had to solve so many problems. How do you address computers on different networks? They invented the IP address system. How do you make sure data gets through reliably, even on unreliable networks? They invented TCP with its acknowledgements and retransmissions. How do you handle networks with different packet sizes? They invented fragmentation, where big packets get broken into smaller pieces if needed. The first version of TCP/IP was tested in 1975. It worked, but it had problems. So they kept refining it. They tested it on different types of networks. They worked with other researchers to improve it. And in 1983, ARPANET officially switched from its old protocol to TCP/IP. January 1st, 1983 is sometimes called Flag Day, the day the ARPANET became the Internet. This wasn't a smooth transition. Lots of computers had to be updated. Software had to be rewritten. There were bugs and crashes, but they made it work. And once TCP/IP was in place, other networks could join. CSNET, a network for computer science departments, joined. NSFNET, funded by the National Science Foundation, joined. Networks in other countries joined. The Internet was becoming global. Through the 1980s, the Internet was still mostly academic. Regular people weren't online yet. But the culture of the Internet was forming. People were using email, lots of email. Mailing lists became popular, where groups of people interested in the same topic could send messages to each other. Usenet appeared, a system of discussion forums organized by topic. You could find a group about anything and join the conversation. This was social media before social media existed. People also started thinking about security. The Internet was designed to be open and to trust everyone on the network. But as it grew, that became a problem. In 1988, the Morris worm, one of the first major computer worms, spread across the Internet and infected thousands of computers. It wasn't designed to cause damage, but it had a bug that made it spread too aggressively and it overloaded systems. This was a wake-up call. The Internet needed better security. The 1990s changed everything. The Cold War ended. The Internet was no longer just a military project. The National Science Foundation was running the backbone of the Internet in the US, but they wanted to hand it over to commercial companies. In 1995, NSFNET was shut down, and commercial Internet providers took over. This was a huge shift. Now the Internet was a business. At the same time, the web was exploding. Tim Berners-Lee's invention at CERN was spreading across the world. The first website went live in 1991. By 1992, there were 10 websites. By 1993, there were 130. By 1994, there were 2,700. By 1995, there were 23,000. The growth was exponential. The Mosaic browser made the web accessible. Then came Netscape Navigator in 1994, which was even better. Internet Explorer came along in 1995. Suddenly, anyone could browse the web. You didn't need to be a computer expert. You didn't need to understand how it worked. You just clicked and explored. Businesses rushed online. Everyone wanted a website. Everyone wanted to be part of this new digital world. The dot-com boom was in full swing. Investors threw money at any company with a .com in its name. Some of those companies became giants: Amazon, eBay, Google. Others crashed and burned: Pets.com, Webvin, Cosmo. The dot-com bubble burst in 2000, and a lot of companies went out of business. But the ones that survived became the biggest companies in the world. And through all of this, the Internet kept growing. Faster connections, more users, more content. Broadband replaced dial-up. Wi-Fi made the Internet wireless. Smartphones put the Internet in your pocket. Social media connected billions of people. Streaming video replaced television. Cloud computing put your data everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Today, the Internet is so integrated into our lives that we barely think about it. You expect to have Internet access everywhere. You expect it to work. You expect it to be fast. But all of this, every single bit of it, traces back to those early choices. The choice to use packet switching. The choice to build the ARPANET. The choice to create open protocols. The choice to make the web free. Think about how many things had to go right for this to happen. If any one of those choices had been different, we might be living in a completely different world. No Google, no Amazon, no YouTube, no social media, no streaming, no apps, no smartphones as we know them. The entire shape of modern life would be different. And here's something wild to think about. The people who built the early internet mostly didn't get rich from it. Frank Hart and the BBN team built the ARPANET, but they were just doing their job. Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf created TCP/IP, but they didn't patent it. Tim Berners-Lee invented the web, but he gave it away. They all had successful careers, sure, but they didn't become billionaires. The people who became billionaires were the ones who built businesses on top of the internet later. Jeff Bezos with Amazon, Larry Page and Sergey Brin with Google, Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook. The pioneers created the foundation and walked away. And because they walked away, because they didn't try to control what they created, the internet became something bigger than any one person or company. It became a tool for humanity. There's a lesson in that. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is build something and let it go. Build it well, build it open. Build it for everyone, and then step back and see what people do with it. The internet wasn't built by one person with a grand vision. It was built by many people making good choices, solving problems, and sharing their solutions. Of course, not everyone was making good choices. Along the way, there were fights about who would control the internet. Governments wanted to regulate it. Companies wanted to own pieces of it. There were debates about net neutrality, about whether internet providers should be able to control what content flows through their networks. There were debates about privacy and surveillance. There were debates about copyright and piracy. There were debates about free speech and censorship. These debates are still happening. The internet is constantly evolving. New technologies emerge. New problems appear. And people have to keep making choices about how the internet should work and who it should serve. But the foundation is still there. The open, decentralized, packet-switched network that Frank Hart and his team built. The TCP/IP protocol that Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf created. The web that Tim Berners-Lee gave to the world. One more thing I want to talk about is what didn't happen. There were other visions for how computer networks could work. In the 1980s, several big companies were building their own proprietary networks. IBM had SN, a Digital Equipment Corporation, had DECnet. Novell had NetWare. France built Minitel, a nationwide computer network that was actually ahead of the internet in many ways. Minitel launched in 1982 and gave millions of French people access to online services years before the web existed. But all of these proprietary networks had the same problem. They were closed. You could only connect to them using specific equipment from specific companies. They were controlled by one organization. And that meant they couldn't grow the way the internet grew. They couldn't adapt. They couldn't evolve. When the open internet came along, these closed networks couldn't compete. Most of them are gone now. Minitel shut down in 2012. The others faded away even earlier. This shows why openness matters. The internet won not because it was better funded or better marketed. It won because it was open. Anyone could join. Anyone could contribute. Anyone could innovate. And that created a positive feedback loop. More people joined because it was useful. More people contributed because they could. More innovation happened because it was possible. And the network got better and better. There's also a darker side to this story that we need to talk about. The internet was built by a specific group of people in a specific time and place. Mostly men, mostly in America, mostly white. And the internet reflects their biases and blind spots. The early internet culture was often hostile to women. Online harassment became a huge problem. Privacy was untaken seriously because the people building the internet didn't think they had anything to hide. Security was an afterthought because everyone trusted each other. And the open nature of the internet that made it so powerful also made it vulnerable. Bad actors can use the internet just as easily as good actors. Scammers, hackers, terrorists, authoritarian governance. The tools that give people freedom can also be used to take freedom away. China built the Great Firewall to control what its citizens can see online. Russia uses the internet to spread propaganda. Criminals use it for fraud and theft. None of this was intentional. The people who built the internet were trying to solve technical problems. They wanted to connect computers and share information. They didn't set out to change the world. They didn't predict social media or streaming video or smartphones. They definitely didn't predict the problems the internet would create. But their choices shaped everything that came after. So what can we learn from this? I think there are a few key lessons. First, choices matter. The choice to make something open or closed. The choice to share or hoard. The choice to collaborate or compete. These choices have consequences that ripple out for decades. The people who built the internet made good choices, and we're all benefiting from that. Second, you don't always know what you're building. The ARPANET was supposed to be a way for researchers to share computer time. It became the internet. The web was supposed to be a way for scientists to share documents. It became the platform for all human knowledge and communication. You can't predict where innovation will lead. All you can do is build something good and see what happens. Third, open beats closed in the long run. Proprietary networks seemed like a good idea. They gave companies control. They let them charge for access. But they couldn't compete with an open network that anyone could join and improve. Openness enables innovation in ways that closed systems can't match. And fourth, technology is built by people. It reflects their values and choices. If we want better technology, we need people making better choices. We need diversity in who builds our tools. We need to think about consequences. We need to prioritize people over profits. That's not always happening right now, but it could. The internet is far from perfect. But it's also one of the most remarkable things humans have ever built. A global network connecting billions of people, handling trillions of messages every day, enabling communication and commerce and creativity on a scale that was unimaginable 60 years ago. And it all comes back to packet switching, to the ARPANET, to the choices that Frank Hart and Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf and Tim Berners-Lee and so many others made. They chose to build something new. They chose to make it open. They chose to share it with the world. And because of those choices, you're watching this video right now. You're connected to a network that spans the globe. You have access to more information than any human in history. You can talk to people on the other side of the planet instantly. You can learn anything. You can create anything. You can share your ideas with the world. That's the power of the choice that created the internet. One decision to try something new. One decision to make it open. One decision that changed everything. And the story isn't over. The internet is still evolving. New choices are being made every day. Choices about privacy, about control, about who gets access, about what's allowed. These choices will shape the internet of the future, just like the early choices shaped the internet we have now. So the next time you're online, take a second to think about how you got there. Think about the engineers who stayed up late solving impossible problems. Think about the researchers who shared their work freely. Think about the choice to build something open that anyone could use. Because that choice, that one decision, created the world we live in today. But let's dig deeper into something that doesn't get talked about enough. The actual physical reality of building these early networks. Because when we talk about the internet, we talk about it like it's this invisible thing in the clouds. But the internet is physical. It's cables and computers and routers and servers. And in the beginning, getting all of that physical infrastructure in place was a massive undertaking. When BBN was building the first IMPs, they had to ship these 900-pound machines across the country. Remember, this is 1969. There's no FedEx overnight shipping. These machines were delicate. They were full of custom electronics. If something broke during shipping, they'd have to fix it or build a new one. And the timeline was tight. They couldn't afford delays. Each IMP had to be installed at a university or research lab. And these places weren't set up for this kind of equipment. They had to find room for it. They had to provide power. They had to make sure the environment was right because these machines generated heat and needed cooling. They had to run cables to connect the IMP to the host computer. And they had to train people on how to use it. The connection between IMPs was done using regular phone lines at first. Leased lines from the phone company. These were 50 kilobit per second connections. Which sounds incredibly slow now, but back then it was actually pretty fast for data. The phone companies didn't really understand what ARPANET was doing. They were used to voice calls. They had to adapt their infrastructure to handle continuous data connections. And here's something interesting. The phone companies weren't exactly thrilled about the ARPANET. They saw it as competition. AT&T, which had a monopoly on phone service in the US at the time, had their own vision for computer networking. They wanted to build a centralized system that they would control. They didn't like this decentralized packet-switched network that ARPANET was building. There was tension there. But ARPA had government funding and government backing, so the phone companies had to cooperate. They provided the lines. But they were skeptical. They didn't think packet switching would work. They thought circuit switching was the only way. Some AT&T engineers openly said the ARPANET was a waste of money and would never scale. They were wrong, of course. But at the time, it wasn't obvious. Let me tell you about some of the people who made this happen, beyond the big names everyone knows. There was a woman named Patricia Lowin who worked at BBN. She was one of the early programmers working on the IMP software. Women were actually fairly common in computer programming in the 1960s, more so than in later decades. Programming was seen as detail-oriented work, kind of like secretarial work, so it wasn't considered prestigious yet. That changed as computers became more important, and then suddenly it became male-dominated. But in the early days, women like Patricia Lowin were doing crucial work. There was a researcher named Steve Crocker who was a graduate student at UCLA when the first IMP arrived. Steve started organizing meetings with other graduate students at the various ARPANET sites to figure out how the host computers should talk to each other. The IMPs could move packets, but what should those packets contain? What language should the computers speak? Steve and his friends started writing documents to answer these questions. He called them requests for comments, or RFCs. He chose that name because he didn't want to sound too authoritative. These were grad students, not professors or government officials. So he framed the documents as suggestions that people could comment on. That RFC system is still used today. Every internet standard, every protocol starts as an RFC. It's how the internet community shares ideas and builds consensus. And it all started because Steve Crocker was being humble and collaborative. If he had been more authoritarian, if he had tried to dictate how things should work, the culture of the internet might have developed very differently. Another key person was John Postel. He was also at UCLA and he became the editor of the RFC series. John had this role for almost 30 years until his death in 1998. He was the guy who decided which RFCs became official standards. He managed the system of IP addresses and domain names. He had enormous power over the internet, but he used it carefully. He always tried to build consensus. He always tried to do what was best for the network, not what would benefit him personally. There's a famous principle in internet design called the robustness principle, or Postel's law, named after John Postel. It says, be conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you accept. Meaning, when you're sending data, follow the rules strictly. But when you're receiving data, be flexible and try to work with what you get, even if it's not perfect. This principle helped the internet work even when different implementations didn't quite match up. It made the internet more forgiving, more resilient. Let's talk about some of the early applications that ran on the ARPANET, beyond email. One of the first was remote login called Telnet. This let you log into a computer across the network and use it as if you were sitting in front of it. For researchers, this was huge. If you needed to run a program on a powerful computer at another university, you could just Telnet in and do it. You didn't have to travel. You didn't have to send your data on tapes. You just connected over the network. Another early application was file transfer, FTP. This let you copy files from one computer to another across the network. Again, this seems basic now, but in the 1970s it was revolutionary. Researchers could share data instantly. They could collaborate on papers. They could send software to each other. The speed of research increased dramatically. There were also early experiments with voice over the network. Could you make phone calls using packet switching instead of circuit switching? It turned out you could, but the quality wasn't great with 1970s technology. The packets would sometimes arrive out of order or get delayed, and that made the voice sound choppy. So voice over IP didn't really take off until much later, in the 1990s and 2000s. When networks got faster and the technology improved, people also experimented with real-time messaging, the ancestor of today's instant messaging and chat. You could send short messages back and forth in real time, having a conversation by typing. This was different from email, which was more like sending letters. Chat was like talking. Some people loved it. Some people thought it was a waste of network resources. But it showed that the network could support all kinds of communication, not just the uses that were originally planned. As the ARPANET grew through the 1970s, managing it became more complex. ARPA created a network control center to monitor the network and respond to problems. If an IMP went down, they needed to know about it and fix it. If there was a routing problem, they needed to diagnose it. This was the beginning of network operations, a field that's now critical to keeping the internet running. They also had to deal with security issues, even though security wasn't a major concern at first. The ARPANET was a closed network. Only authorized sites could connect. Only trusted users had access. So there wasn't much worry about hackers or attackers. But as the network grew, this assumption became less valid. People started sharing passwords. Unauthorized users found ways to get access. Nothing too serious happened, but it was a warning sign. One interesting challenge was managing the growth of the network itself. Every time a new site wanted to join the ARPANET, someone had to configure the IMPs to know about the new node. They had to update routing tables. They had to make sure the new site was compatible. This was all done manually at first. As the network got bigger, this became unsustainable. They needed automatic ways to handle routing and configuration. This led to the development of routing protocols, algorithms that let routers figure out the best paths through the network automatically. The Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP, which handles routing between different networks on the internet today, came out of this need. BGP is incredibly complex and has its own problems, but it's what makes the internet work at scale. When you visit a website, your data might pass through a dozen different networks on its way there. BGP is what tells routers how to get your data to the right place. Now let's talk about the transition from ARPANET to the internet. This wasn't a single moment. It was a gradual process that took years. Through the 1970s and early 1980s, the ARPANET was just one of many networks. There was CSNET for computer science departments that weren't on ARPANET. There was BitNet, connecting universities. There was Usenet for discussion groups. There were networks in other countries, and they all worked differently. The genius of TCP/IP was that it could connect all these different networks. You didn't have to rebuild everything. You just had to add TCP/IP support, and then you could talk to any other network that also supported TCP/IP. This was incredibly powerful. It meant the internet could grow organically. New networks could join without asking permission from some central authority. But getting everyone to adopt TCP/IP wasn't easy. The ARPANET switching to TCP/IP in 1983 was a big push. But there were other protocols competing for attention. The International Organization for Standardization, ISO, was developing their own protocol called OSI. The Open Systems Interconnection Protocol was supposed to be the official international standard for networking. Governments and big companies liked it because it was an official standard created by a recognized organization. TCP/IP, on the other hand, was created by a bunch of researchers and distributed freely. It wasn't an official standard in the traditional sense. But it worked. It was already being used, and it was free. OSI was complex and expensive to implement. TCP/IP was simpler and free, so TCP/IP won. By the late 1980s, it was clear that TCP/IP was going to be the protocol of the internet. OSI became a footnote in history. This was another choice that mattered. If governments and companies had insisted on using OSI, if they had refused to adopt TCP/IP, the internet might have developed very differently. It might have been slower to grow. It might have been more centralized. But instead, the open, free protocol won. Let me tell you about the National Science Foundation's role in all of this. In the 1980s, NSF wanted to give more researchers access to supercomputers. These were incredibly powerful machines, but there were only a few of them in the country. NSF decided to build a network to connect these supercomputers so researchers everywhere could use them. They called it NSFNET. NSFNET was built on top of the ARPANET's technology using TCP/IP, but it was much faster. The ARPANET was still running on those 50 kilobit lines. NSFNET started with 56 kilobit lines, then upgraded to T1 lines at 1.5 megabits per second. That's 30 times faster. And NSFNET connected more universities. By the late 1980s, NSFNET was bigger and more important than ARPANET. NSF had a policy that NSFNET could only be used for research and education. No commercial traffic. This made sense when it was a government-funded network. But as the internet grew, this policy became a problem. Companies wanted to use the internet. They wanted to connect their networks. They wanted to do business online. But they couldn't because the main backbone of the internet was NSFNET, and NSFNET didn't allow commercial use. This led to a crucial decision in the early 1990s. NSF decided to get out of the internet business. They would shut down NSFNET and let commercial companies take over. They would help fund the transition, but then the internet would be run by private companies, not the government. This was a huge risk. Would commercial companies maintain the open, interconnected internet? Or would they try to create walled gardens, separate networks that didn't talk to each other? Thankfully, the openness of TCP/IP and the culture of the internet was strong enough that the commercial internet stayed interconnected. Different internet service providers agreed to exchange traffic with each other. They created internet exchange points, physical locations where their networks would connect. This allowed the internet to keep working as one global network, even though it was no longer run by the government. The commercialization of the internet in the mid-1990s opened the floodgates. Companies could now build internet businesses legally. Amazon, eBay, and countless others got their start. Internet service providers started offering access to regular people, not just universities and companies. America Online, CompuServe, and Prodigy had been offering online services since the 1980s, but they were mostly closed systems. Now they connected to the real internet, and suddenly their users could access everything. The dot-com boom was wild. Between 1995 and 2000, thousands of internet companies were founded. Stock prices went crazy. Companies with no profits and barely any revenue were worth billions of dollars. Everyone was convinced that the internet would change everything, and they wanted to be part of it. And they were right that the internet would change everything. But they were wrong about how fast it would happen and which companies would succeed. A lot of the dot-com companies had terrible business models. They were spending millions on advertising and customer acquisition, losing money on every transaction, and hoping to make it up in volume. That doesn't work. When the bubble burst in 2000, hundreds of companies went bankrupt. Trillions of dollars of stock value disappeared. A lot of people lost their jobs and their savings. But the internet itself kept growing. The companies that survived the dot-com crash became some of the biggest companies in the world. Amazon almost went bankrupt but made it through and became a retail giant. Google, which started in 1998, became the dominant search engine and expanded into dozens of other businesses. eBay became the go-to place for online auctions. PayPal made online payments easy. These companies had real business models and real value, and they thrived. The 2000s brought new innovations. Social networking became huge. Friendster launched in 2002. MySpace launched in 2003 and became the most popular website in the world for a while. Facebook launched in 2004, initially just for college students, then expanded to everyone. Twitter launched in 2006. These platforms changed how people communicated and shared information. YouTube launched in 2005 and made video sharing easy. Suddenly, anyone could upload a video and potentially reach millions of people. Traditional media companies freaked out. They worried about copyright infringement and losing control. But YouTube became one of the most important websites in the world. It's now owned by Google and has over 2 billion users. Smartphones changed everything again. The iPhone launched in 2007 and made the internet truly mobile. You could access the internet from anywhere, not just when you were sitting at a computer. Apps became huge. Instagram, Snapchat, Uber, all these companies built their businesses on smartphones. The internet went from something you used occasionally to something that was with you all the time. Cloud computing changed how the internet infrastructure works. Instead of companies running their own servers, they could rent computing power from Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud. This made it much easier and cheaper to start an internet business. You didn't need to buy expensive servers. You didn't need to hire people to maintain them. You just rented what you needed from the cloud. Streaming video became viable as internet speeds increased. Netflix started as a DVD-by-mail service but transitioned to streaming. Now most people watch TV and movies through streaming services rather than cable or broadcast TV. The whole media industry has been transformed. Music went through a similar transformation with Spotify and other streaming services, but along with all these innovations came problems. Big tech companies accumulated enormous power. Google controls most of the search market. Facebook controls most social networking. Amazon controls huge portions of online retail and cloud computing. These companies have more data about people than any organization in history. They know what you search for, what you watch, who you talk to, where you go. That's a lot of power for private companies to have. Privacy has become a huge concern. The internet was built without much thought for privacy. The early protocols didn't encrypt data by default. Anyone who could intercept your packets could read what you were sending. HTTPS, the secure version of HTTP, helps with this. But there are still many ways your online activity can be tracked and monitored. Governments also realized they could use the internet for surveillance. Edward Snowden's revelations in 2013 showed that the NSA was collecting massive amounts of internet data, both on foreigners and on American citizens. Other countries do similar things. China monitors its citizens' internet use extensively. Russia uses the internet for propaganda and disinformation campaigns. The open internet that was supposed to bring freedom has also become a tool for control. Misinformation spread on social media is another huge problem. False stories go viral. Conspiracy theories flourish. Foreign actors use social media to influence elections. The platforms struggle to moderate content without being accused of censorship. There's no easy solution. The same openness that makes the internet so valuable also makes it vulnerable to abuse. Cybercrime has become a major industry. Hackers steal credit card numbers and personal information. Ransomware attacks lock up computer systems and demand payment. State-sponsored hackers attack critical infrastructure. The internet has created new forms of crime that are hard to prevent and hard to prosecute. But despite all these problems, the internet remains an incredible tool. It has democratized access to information. Anyone with an internet connection can learn almost anything. You can take courses from top universities for free. You can read academic papers. You can watch educational videos. The sum of human knowledge is available to more people than ever before in history. The internet has enabled new forms of creativity. Musicians can distribute their music without record labels. Artists can sell their work directly to fans. Writers can publish their own books. YouTubers can build audiences of millions. The gatekeepers have lost some of their power. That's not entirely good because gatekeepers also provided quality control. But it's opened up opportunities for people who never could have had them before. The internet has connected people across the world. You can have friends in other countries. You can collaborate with people you've never met in person. You can learn about cultures and perspectives different from your own. This has the potential to make us more understanding and compassionate. It doesn't always work out that way, but the potential is there. And economically, the internet has created enormous value. E-commerce makes shopping more convenient and often cheaper. Remote work, which became essential during the COVID pandemic, is enabled by the internet. Countless businesses depend on the internet to reach customers and operate. The internet has increased productivity and created whole new industries. So when we think about the choice that created the internet, we need to think about all of this. The good and the bad. The opportunities and the dangers. The internet is not inherently good or bad. It's a tool. How we use it, how we govern it, how we build on it. Those are choices. And those choices matter just as much as the choices that Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf and Tim Berners-Lee made decades ago. The story of the internet is still being written. New technologies are emerging. Artificial intelligence is starting to change how we interact with information. Virtual and augmented reality might change how we experience the internet. Blockchain and cryptocurrency promise to decentralize power, though it's unclear if they'll deliver on that promise. Quantum computing might require us to completely rethink internet security. And there are big questions about the future of the internet that we need to answer. Should the internet be treated as a public utility, like water or electricity? Should big tech companies be broken up to reduce their power? How do we balance free speech with preventing harm? How do we protect privacy while still allowing innovation? How do we make the internet accessible to everyone, including the billions of people who still don't have reliable access? These are not easy questions. They're political and philosophical as much as technical. What's clear is that the fundamental architecture of the internet, the choices made in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, has held up remarkably well. Packet switching still works. TCP/IP still works. The web still works. These technologies have scaled from connecting 4 computers to connecting billions of devices. That's extraordinary. And the principles behind those technologies, openness and collaboration, remain relevant. The internet works because people cooperate. Different networks agree to exchange traffic. Different companies agree to follow standards. Volunteers contribute to open source software that runs much of the internet. This cooperation isn't guaranteed. It takes work to maintain, but it's what makes the internet possible. So the next time you send a message, watch a video, or look something up online, remember the story behind it. Remember the engineers who solved impossible problems. Remember the choice to make it open. Remember that the internet is built by people, and the choices people make matter. The internet we have is the result of thousands of decisions, big and small. And the internet we'll have in the future will be determined by the decisions we make now. What kind of internet do we want? That's up to us. If you found this story interesting, hit the subscribe button.